Over the years, I have received some really great advice to help me with my writing and also some really bad advice. This advice has come from a number of places, including the master's degree in creative writing that I did, from famous authors who have shared this advice in quotes or in books, online from other sources, and from people I've just spoken to. A lot of it is really well-known advice, some of it is a little bit more niche, but how helpful is it actually? I'm Sam, a romance author based in the UK, and today we're going to take a look at some of the best and worst writing advice I have received by tier ranking it. Okay, so let's talk about some of this writing advice. This is in a very random order. The tiers that we've got here are Bible. This is writing advice I absolutely swear by, I use all the time. Aspirational is, I think it's really solid advice and I do try to do it. Sometimes it's easier said than done. Then we've got great in theory, less in practice. Pretty self-explanatory, but advice that like sounds good and I can make it make sense, but like in practice, it's actually not the most practical advice. WTF does this even mean? Stuff that just doesn't really resonate or it just doesn't even really make sense. And then delete my number. Please stop talking to me about this. This is terrible advice. Do not listen to this. So let's start. Let's just go in order. The first piece of advice is never use a long word where a short one will do. So this is actually advice from George Orwell. And the idea here is that you should never use something complicated where something simple will suffice. And I'm going to put this in aspirational because I think this is really solid advice. I think that one of the things that new writers tend to do that is less than ideal is what's called like purple prose. So where they'll just really overwrite something and just try to sound really, really smart and like end up coming across like a thesaurus, like Joey writing the reference letter for Monica and Chandler in Friends.
What was this sentence originally?
Oh, they are warm, nice people with big hearts. And that became, they are humid, prepossessing Homo sapiens with full-sized aortic pumps. Yeah, and hey, I really mean it, dude.
And so I think the spirit of this is really aspirational. All right, description needs to support character, plot, or both. There are a lot of people that have given this advice, but one of my favorite quotes about it is from Kurt Vonnegut, that every sentence must do one of two things: reveal character or advance the action. And note that that says every sentence. And I think Brandon Sanderson especially talks about how that really applies to description. Like when you're describing characters, when you're describing worlds, that description should support character, plot, or both. Again, I'm going to put that in aspirational. I think it's really solid advice. However, there are sometimes, and especially in certain genres like romance, where actually just describing something unapologetically is really satisfying for the reader. So this one's cut off a little bit, but it says, find the hope in the despair and the despair in the hope. So this is a quote from Shaylin of Shaylin Writes, which is another YouTube channel that I love. Everything should feel like a little bit bittersweet because everything's a trade-off. So someone's got to sacrifice something in order to get the good thing because that's what makes the payoff be there. And similarly, if things are really, really bad and you don't have any hope in it, then why would the reader keep going? So having a little bit of hope in the despair is really important to pull people forward, but having a little bit of despair in the hope makes those high moments feel more realistic and more relatable. I'm putting it in aspirational, not Bible, because I think for my genre in particular, like there are some times where you just need an unapologetic happy ever after with no despair whatsoever. Like, yes, there are sacrifices to get you there, but like part of your job as a romance author, if you're going for a happy ever after, is to like minimize the despair at the end. These beige ones are a little bit hard to read, sorry, but this one says, all fiction has to be as honest as you can make it. This is a Neil Gaiman quote, and I think this is absolute Bible for me. I think that obviously fiction is made up, but it's about that human element, and I think it's so important to like be in touch with what makes people human and what makes them tick, and to understand motivations and to understand desires, and to make that as honest as you possibly can. rather than making things feel contrived or like they're not self-aware. You can fix anything but a blank page. This is Nora Roberts, I believe, and I am going to put this in Bible as well. I also believe you can fix anything but a blank page. Go deep rather than wide. This is something that I've heard a lot of different places, but is also really heavily based on Brandon Sanderson's third law of magic. I've got another video about how I apply those to other genres if you want to check that out in the description. This is absolutely excellent advice. However, I'm going to put it in aspirational because, again, I think that for certain genres, that is easier said than done. All right, let's go to the other end. X is popular, so try writing that. The number of times that I've heard people, this tends to be really casual advice rather than being from famous writers or anything, but the number of times I've heard people in passing be like, oh, you know what, like werewolf erotica is really in right now, maybe you should try to write some of that. The number of times that I've heard people recommend someone write something based on how popular it is astounding, and I'm going to say delete my number on this one. I think this is just really bad advice in general. Write what you enjoy, write what keeps you going, write what you know. However, our next piece of advice is less good. I'm going to put this in what the fuck does this even mean? Because, listen, fiction is literally making stuff up. And if you only write what you know, for a lot of us, you're going to run out of material really, really quickly. Obviously, when we're talking about like owned voices and stuff, this maybe is a little bit more relevant. But I think telling people to write what you know is really, really limiting. It doesn't even account for genres like science fiction and fantasy. You could try to make it relate to this, you know, be as honest as you can thing, but actually I just think it's not great advice and it's going to steer people down the wrong path. Next, let's go to focus only on the book in front of you. So this is advice from Henry Miller, who says, forget the books you want to write, think only of the book you are writing. And I think that this is good advice in theory, less in practice. I personally like to have a side piece at all times. The reason for that is because there will be some days where you're just like, I cannot look at this freaking story for one more second. And in order to maintain your writing habit, it's nice to have something else to fall back on. Also, if you are working with a publisher or an agent, there will be times where you do have to be thinking multiple books ahead, and that's not a bad thing. The important thing is to make sure that thinking about those things isn't keeping you from the book that you're meant to be writing. So I would say focus on the book in front of you, but let your peripheral vision take in the ones past that, maybe. Then we have the old chestnut show, don't tell. Again, great in theory, less in practice. There is a really good quote, and I don't know who it's from, but it says, don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of light on broken glass. And I think that that encapsulates what show don't tell is meant to be saying, which is sensory detail is always going to pay off better than narrative statement. However, if you show everything rather than just telling, your book is going to be so long and the reader is going to have to sift through so much unnecessary detail. I think that sometimes it is better to tell, and sometimes it's more satisfying for the reader to do it that way. Everything should point towards your theme. This is really specifically taken from the book Take Off Your Pants by Libby Hawker, which talks about having like a central theme to your book and everything points towards that. And I'm going to put this in great in theory, less in practice as well, because I think that if you do it really well, this is a good piece of advice, but I think it's really easy to hear that advice and to fall into being like a little bit didactic in your writing. And what I mean by that is if everything is pointing towards the same theme, then it can feel a little bit repetitive and it can feel like you're trying to shove a message down your reader's throat, and nobody wants that. I think it's good to have a theme, but I don't think everything should have to point to that. I think as long as you know what the theme is, and as long as your main character arc is pointing towards that theme, then as long as everything else is in service of that character arc, you'll be fine. Then we've got Don't Let Fear of Judgment Hold You Back. And this is from Neil Gaiman, and it is absolute Bible material. Especially in the romance genre, I really struggle with fear of judgment over my spicy scenes, over the fact that I'm writing romance instead of like hard-hitting literary fiction that depresses everybody. And it's really easy to like let that fear of judgment kind of take over, but if you do that, you're never going to get a story out. All right. Right in the same place at the same time every day. I recently reviewed On Writing by Stephen King, and I'll leave a link to that video in the description. And he really harps on this, to write at the same place, at the same time, every single day. He also talks about not watching TV. He says read every single day. He's got all these rules. And I had a lot of problems with a lot of Stephen King's advice. You can go watch that video to find out. I actually think this one is aspirational. I don't think it's perfect. I think it's easier said than done, but I do think that this is good advice, because when you sit down at the same time in the same place every day, your brain will engage in the same way over time. So every time that I sit down at my desk with my twinkle lights on in the background at 7 p.m., my brain knows that it's time to write, and it will instantly start thinking about that because I've trained it to do that, because that's what I do every single weekday. All right, don't include details that could date your book. I hear this one most from agents. Specifically, there's an agent on the Shit No One Tells You About Writing podcast that says this all the time, like not to include restaurants or technology or things like that that could date your book. And to that I say, like, there is a lot that is going to date my book, not least of which is the date at the front of my book in the copyright page, but also just like the language that's being used is always going to be a symptom of the time that you're in. And I think that like including those details to really ground someone in a location and in a reality is not a bad thing. So I'm going to say great in theory, less in practice for this one. And frankly, if people are still reading my books 20 years from now, like absolutely fine that they feel dated. I don't care. If they're still being read that far from now, I will be happy to be considered dated. Okay, this next one is After a While, the Muse Shows Up Too. And this is a snippet from a quote from Isabel Allende that says, show up, show up, show up. And after a while, the muse shows up too. Now, the spirit behind this quote I love, because a lot of famous authors, and especially Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison as well, will talk about the muse as in like inspiration and how it will just come to you and bestow upon you the great words that you should say. And that's just not true for most people most of the time. So the nature of what Isabel Allende is saying here is that if you continue to show up, that is how inspiration comes to you. And I love that. And I'm going to put it high up, but I'm not going to put it in Bible. I'm going to put it in aspirational. And here's why it's not quite Bible for me. Because there are some days where the muse is not going to show up for you. There are some weeks and months where the muse is not going to show up for you. There have been times in my life where my writing feels less like a spurt of inspiration and more like a desperate clinging to something. And that's okay. Like, whatever keeps you writing is fine. If the muse is not showing up for you, it's not that you're doing something wrong. Keep showing up. This next one, again, it cut off a little bit, but this is a quote from Zadie Smith that says, protect the time and space in which you write. Keep everybody away from it, even the people who are most important to you. Again, I think that the spirit of this is kind of like the Stephen King, right in the same place at the same time every day. Have that protected space and time for it, and the people that love you will respect that. However, I think that this is a weird way of saying this, because I found that my writing is the richest when I involve the people that love me and when I share it with them and I get that encouragement, even if it's just like telling them what I'm working on. So I'm going to put this in great in theory, less in practice. This next one is the Golden Triangle, and I don't think this is actually a thing. I think that maybe my MA professor made this up because I've tried to find it online and like can't find it anywhere. But the idea here is that the same core tenet of your character is what creates both their good side and their bad side. So their fatal flaw and their greatest value both come from the same place within them, because they're sort of compensations of each other, they're balances of each other. So maybe the same root independence, for example, creates both a fear of commitment as the fatal flaw and a confidence in new situations, which is their greatest value. That's a really easy example, but when you do this, it makes such a difference to your characterization and to the payoff, because it means that in order to tackle that fatal flaw, you have to tackle the root core tenet for that character, which inherently puts the greatest value in jeopardy. So it just adds stakes and it adds complexity to all of your character arcs. And for this reason, this is absolutely Bible advice for me. Next up, we have Write How People Talk. And this one definitely goes in Great in Theory, Less in Practice. Because yes, you want your dialogue to sound natural. No, you don't want people to have these like big ostentatious speeches where they use really big words really spontaneously. But also, people talk in really annoying and repetitive ways, and they use lots of filler words, and that doesn't have any room in your prose. Your prose needs to be saying something, and if you write how people talk, then a lot of times you're going to really circle around the point, because that's how people talk. Like just now, in the last 30 seconds, I've said how people talk like 5 times, and that would be an absolute no-no in dialogue. Next up, we have Leave Yourself Wanting More. This is another nugget from Shit No One Tells You About Writing podcast from the author Bianca Marais, which is basically when you're writing, you want to stop in the middle of a scene or a chapter rather than at like a natural stopping point, because it means when you sit back down to write the next day, it'll be a lot easier for you to jump back into it and get started. And this is Bible advice for me. I do this every single time I write if I can. If I don't do it, I get really cross with myself the next day because it's so much harder to get into it. Next, we have Promise, Progress, and Payoff, and this is another one from Brandon Sanderson. And the idea here is that every single scene has to contain one of these 3 things. It has to contain promise, so you've got to see a glimpse of something, plant a seed for something that will come to fruition later in the story. It needs to progress the plot or the character arc, or it needs to have payoff from some of that earlier promise and progress. Again, absolute Bible advice, really keeps me from having loads of filler scenes in there. Then we have quantity produces quality. Now, this is a concept not just in writing, but really anything creative. And the idea is that like iterating will make you better. And I've seen people rail against this. In fact, when I was like looking up some advice for this video, I saw this in like a list of bad advice for writing. And I fully disagree with that. I think that the more you write, the more in touch you're going to be with how to craft good stories. I'm not going to put it in Bible because I can see how sometimes if you're too focused on quantity, then quality could take a back seat. But like, that's what editors are for. No, I'm going to put it in Bible because that's great. Then we've got Always Carry a Notebook, another nugget from Neil Gaiman. This one's going in Great in Theory, Less in Practice, because who's got a notebook with them at all times? Not this girl. I think a digital version of this is much better, which I guess probably is in the spirit of what he means, but still. Then we have Read Whilst You Write. This is something that Stephen King talks about in On Writing, but it's something that I hear from a lot of other people as well, that it's really important to be consuming stories as you're writing them. I know Donna Tartt, for example, will always read a book that is like thematically linked to the book that she's working on. And I think this is really important. I think sometimes I personally find it a little bit hard to read things that are too similar to what I'm working on. And sometimes I'll be in a position where I'm actually finding it kind of hard to read anything while I'm writing if I'm really, really into it. But the more I've made writing a daily habit rather than like something that I do in like fits and starts, I find it to be a really important thing. So I'm going to put in aspirational. Then we've got Don't Plan the Ending. And I get the idea of this. In fact, I think this specific quote is something about the ending having to be earned by everything that comes before it. So the whole story is like building up to the ending and it should feel almost inevitable by the time you get to it. I get that, but I think that if you don't have an idea of where you're going, you're going to kind of wander a little bit. And you need that North Star of what you're trying to get to, even if that's just the character arc that you want to take someone on. I think true pantsing is really difficult and impractical to do. So I'm going to put this in WTF does this even mean? Then we have a last piece, and I saved this for last for a reason. It says, ignore all the rules if they hold you back. I struggle with this one because I understand the spirit of it, which is that if any of these things don't serve you, like, you can subvert them as long as it still works. But I think that for people that are new to writing or people who are trying to write at volume, that rules offer structure. And sometimes when you're not sure where to go, like referring back to advice that you've gotten can help you make decisions and move forward. And that analysis paralysis can really set in if you don't feel like you've got a set of guidelines to go with. So I'm going to add this one to great in theory, less in practice. I'm going to be honest, this turned out a lot different than I thought it would. I thought I'd have a lot more in like the bad writing advice categories, but it turns out I've had some pretty decent writing advice throughout my life. I'm a little bit light on bad writing advice. In fact, I'm moderately disappointed by the lack of balance in this chart. So why don't you help me out? Why don't you leave in the comments the worst writing advice that you've ever received so that I can just feel a little bit better at the balance in this situation. If you ask me, the best writing advice is to do whatever you need to do to write consistently and to the level that you want to. And I know that sounds really vague, but make it mean whatever it needs to for you. If your goal is to write at a really high output for the purpose of publication, the advice that is applicable to you and the habits that you need to form in order to do that are going to be so different to if your goal is just to fulfill a creative passion or to scratch a creative itch. So make sure that you're really clear on what it is that you want writing to achieve in your life and use that as your North Star for filtering all of the advice that you see. Because what's really good advice for one person might be really bad advice for another person based on the difference in their goals. If you want to find out if I actually follow my favorite writing advice instead of a do as I say, not as I do situation, don't forget to hit subscribe so that you can see the writing vlogs that I publish and you can call me out for not following my own advice. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.